guy here, ready for the 1 o'clock session. And the first place we want to go, after thinking about it, to listen to the investing in gold, silver, and battery metals. Interested to hear what battery metals he's coming up with and what he thinks is important. So let's go in and kind of listen for a bit and see what we think. Should we get one? USB drive. Thank you.
Test.
All right, can everybody hear me fine without using a mic?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
We'd like to welcome everyone to the session starting at 1 o'clock. Our session today is God is a Mathematician, and our presenter is Daniel Estrepa.
I've heard some of Joe Biden. That's good. Wow, that's great stuff. Is there any shareholders in the audience? Shareholders? Excellent, excellent. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with mineral royalties, you can hold a royalty on a mineral property or a mining property, much like you can have a royalty on oil and gas property, or on playwrights, or on music, or something like that. So when somebody produces metals or other minerals from a mine, you can collect a royalty on that. And so that's what EMX royalty does, is we actually create royalties, and then we look to partner those properties off, and then the partner develops the property, and if it goes into production, then we collect a royalty on that. We'll get into more depth on this here, but that's the premise. There's our forward-looking statement. All right, we take a three-pronged approach to our business model: royalty generation, where we create royalties on mining properties; royalty acquisitions, so we supplement our organically derived royalties, or the royalties that we create, by acquiring royalties when we can find those at favorable pricing valuations. But that's become extremely competitive because the mining industry has realized how beneficial and how cost-effective mineral royalties are relative to mining. So if you're going to build a mine and then operate that, that's a very risky and very capital-intensive endeavor. And you can do an end run around that by simply having a royalty. So mining business statistics tell us that on average, a mine operates at about an 8% profit margin. A lot of our royalties are 2% royalties. So essentially, we're getting 25% of the average profits on a mine without spending hundreds of millions, and in many cases billions of dollars to construct a mine, or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year in ongoing operating expenses to keep that endeavor going each year. So all we have to do is have our
Well, that appeared to be less about.
Yeah, the actual, like, where it's at is he's trying to sell something.
Yeah,
it seems like
he's trying to sell
his
product
business, his
for
business model.
royalties.
Whereas this next guy, I think what he's trying to sell is trust in the government somewhat more than anything. But, you know, he's a FEMA guy.
Or we can say. So let's go in and take a look at what's going on here. Now he's going to be talking about responding to disasters and all that fun kind. He's going to be talking about responding to disasters and all that fun kind of stuff.
A disaster, everybody, your resources are overwhelmed. Okay, it doesn't matter what type of resource that you need. Typically, on any type of emergency call, you're going to get all three agencies. You're going to get EMS, you're going to get fire, and police. In California, when you say EMS, all of our firefighters are paramedics as well. Not in every state is that the case, but in California, it is because we know what's what it falls. So, disaster is any time that your resources are overwhelmed. So, I go on an NBC, motor vehicle crash, and I've got 5 vehicles involved, and I've got 10 patients. 2 engine companies, truck company, and time. You think I'm gonna have the resources to take care of 10 people? No. That's a disaster. It's no longer an emergency, it's a disaster. I have to call for more resources and get them there. How long do you think it's gonna take? Well, California's gonna be pretty quick. But in another agency, if you're in a rural area, you've got a volunteer fire department, or in the sheriff's department, you've got one in the county or something like that, it's gonna take quite a while, right? So your resources are overwhelmed. So I have a critical patient in this motor vehicle crash. Critical. How many paramedics and how many EMTs do you think it's going to take for that one patient? Anybody have an answer? Okay. 1 paramedic, 2 EMTs for a critical patient. Guess how many people are typically on an income? 3. 2 EMTs and a paramedic. But I've got 10 people. 5 of them are critical, and 5 of them aren't.
So that means you activate 5 units.
Yeah. That's going to take some time. Now, if we get some things, the police officer gets there, for example, they radio and say, hey, we've got 5 vehicles, supplies laying everywhere. As a county chief, I pick up on that and I start calling our resources right away, if they're available. Okay, if they're available. It's not uncommon to have a medical emergency. The next engine company goes that medical emergency, then fire breaks out. 2 engine companies are gone. Same thing with PD. They show up, home invasion. 2 officers show up, there's 5 guys there with 70 automatic weapons. You think they have enough resources? Yeah. Okay, so that's what we need to know, and the whole thing behind this is, what are you going to do? When you call 911, and they say, 911, what's your emergency? And you say, someone's having a heart attack, or they're choking. Okay? And they say, well, sorry, we don't have any resources available, we've got 15-minute response time. Okay, somebody's choking, 15-minute response time, 1-5. How long do you think they're gonna last? 30 seconds. Hope they have the corn dragon going on at the same time. Okay? So you, the citizens, are gonna make a difference. In any type of disaster or emergency, you're going to make a difference. How many people have been trained in CPR? Excellent. I'd love to see that. Love to see that. In Seattle, back in the early 80s, they had a big push on teaching all their citizens CPR, for example. And when they would get there, almost all the time, there was a citizen doing CPR. What do you think their survival rate was? Probably 60, 70%. Yes, if we had 0 CPR before they got there, it was about 0. Okay? That's how important, how prevalent it is. Somebody gets stabbed. I was in a jurisdiction that we saw shooting just happens every day. Somebody gets sliced and they're bleeding out. What are you going to do? You can hear the sirens coming, but they're 4 or 5 minutes away. You think 4 or 5 minutes, how long they can last? How long? So what are you going to do? Have you taken your first aid class? Have you taken CPR class? Do you carry your first aid kit with you in your car? My partner in crime over there, what's your name? Had made up these EMS packs, and we had like maybe 15 or 16 people that wanted them. Okay, we put together augmentation packs and all that stuff. I'm talking selling them, and just telling you what we did. How many we ended up selling?
Sold close to 60 of the basic EMS packs, which is a tactical level 3 med pack. And then we put together, based on his 33 years of experience as a paramedic, we put together an augment pack, of which we sold probably 45 of them to augment the basic med pack. And then there was a list of suggested add-ons after that quite a few people did. And it just got our group set up for any emergency. And since he's done a lot of classes on EMS and response. And so we established a group in the Menlo Park that's probably 60 people, 30 to 60 people regularly show up. And we're just getting everybody kind of pulled up and ready for that time when you call 911 and nobody's coming. You're it.
That's right. So I'm going to give you a couple of experiences that I've had that will validate what I'm saying. That in California, for example, we have wildfire. Literally the whole state sends resources.
Well, apparently, that one was simply about like accidents and stuff, and what do you do immediately? It's not a long-term thing like I was looking for. I was looking for something kind of long-term. You know, what you happens 2 months after they don't respond. You know, are you ready for that? But I guess not. So anyways, we got some students over here arguing, supposedly.
That's Urine Brook over there. And this is
Student debate series. Civil disobedience provides a net benefit to society. Try this one, or do you want to go over to the packed one? What we got
it's up to
here?
you. This one is open.
Asking the right questions, philosophic foundations of liberty. They kind of go hand in hand. Should we go on this one first? Let's go.
So what do you need to know today? You left alone. Yes, and you need to be observant, you need to focus, you need to be engaged with kind of the content, the material, you need to be able to go out there and trial and error, go back to that, right? You need to be able to try different things, you need to be able to fail, you need to be able to be engaged. What do you need to know to do all that? You got the wilderness, you got that. Put it the other way, the flip side. How can I stop somebody from thinking? Put a gun to their head. If you put a gun to your head, you stop thinking. I'll give you an example. Let's say, I don't know, anybody here do research in life extension? There's a bunch of longevity. I think Cosa's done some. Imagine anybody in life extension doing research in life extension. You know, a lot less fewer people studying longevity than I would like. I'm getting to that age. I'd really like you to solve the problem. Somebody please quickly. Why? Why do you think they aren't as many? Why isn't it as big of a field in like there's not a lot of venture capital going into it. There's not a huge amount of money going into studying life extension. Anybody know why?
I would also say that more of this has come up because of the longevity rate. Illnesses like Alzheimer's, I think it didn't make sense.
Yes, there's a lot. Yeah, but there's a lot of hopefully it would cure. When we extend human life, we would make it better as well, right? We solve the problem. Well, part of the reason is that imagine you came up tomorrow with some drug, some special drug that we all took, and you basically you live to be 120. What do you think would happen? What would be the first thing you would have to do? You get insurance. Insurance company is reasonable to work with. You can do that. What would be the first thing to do once you invented the fountain of youth? What would you have to do? Like, you'd think this is the biggest market in the world, but you would make more money than any pharmaceutical company in history. You would make $1 gazillion. But what would be the first thing you could do before you could sell me one of those pills? Because I would love to have it. You'd have to get it through the FDA. You'd have to get permission to sell it to me. I'll give you an example. of right now, right? How many of you, I don't know if you want to answer this question, how many of you been vaccinated? I love the vaccine, it's great. Why didn't I get it like 8 months ago? Not you. Like, do you know the vaccines were available in June of last year? Do you know how long it took Moderna to design the vaccine? 2 days. 2 days. Middle of January, they already had the formula. They sent it off. By April, they had vaccines. They were doing phase 1 trials. Right? Why couldn't I get one in June of last year? I'd sign a release of liability. To get on an airplane again, I would pretty much have signed anything away, right? Why couldn't I get it a year? Because they didn't have permission. Because we have a government agency that decides what you can put into your body and what you can't. A government agency that steps in between that researcher, that developer of new technology, and you, the customer. You don't get to decide. They don't get to decide. A government bureaucrat. Not in June. Oh, maybe they did the trials. Maybe they broke them into the trials. Yeah, if you're, put it this way, if you're politically connected, you can get away with a lot of stuff, but that's part of the sickness in which we live, right? But think about if you're a venture capitalist. If somebody comes to you, I've got the idea of longevity pill. Instead of analyzing the market, analyzing the science, analyzing all that, what do you do today? You analyze the regulatory environment. You go and read up about whether the FDA approves longevity treatments. And you might come across a report written by the Biotech Commission for George W. Bush in 2004, I think it was, about whether the FDA should approve longevity drugs or not. And the conclusion was, no. Shouldn't approve longevity. You know, longevity is not a good thing, according to these studies. Why is longevity bad? Yeah, Social Security, bankrupt Social Security. Because even if you're going to live to be 200 years old, you're going to retire at 65, right? Because retirement is cool. That's what we want to do. Nothing. But that's one. What else? What else is bad about living to be 200? Medical costs, Medicare might go up, although, if you're healthier, maybe not. You might actually learn the truth, yeah. No, the one that really killed me, all of these in there somehow, they've got a long list of all the reasons why life extension is not good. But the one that really bothered me was divorce rates would go up. You could be married to the same person for 50 years, but 70 or 100? No way. There's just no way. And you know what? It's more important to stay married than it is to live to be 120. According to Leon Cass, who was the author of this report. Leon Cass, who's like a big shot today at one of the conservative think tanks, right? Because, put aside the reasons. Who are they to decide how long I should live? Who are they to decide who I should invest in? But notice, so once you get that regulations in force, right? Now I have to ask permission. How many people are going to ask for permission? Fewer. Some people will still try. How many people are going to invest in a new technology where they need permission? Fewer. Less money, less researchers, less minds working on the problem. When you put restrictions, limitations, regulations, control, guns to people's heads, it shrinks the scope of thinking. It shrinks the scope of what is possible. It shrinks the values that you can pursue. It cripples that mind. So the reason I have freedom is because I want people thinking. I want people solving that problem of how to live to be 120 or 200 or 300 or whatever that happens to be. I want to see people colonize Mars. I want to see human beings move forward. Life get better. I want to pursue my values without asking for permission, please, bureaucrat, who's never done anything productive in his life. Allow me to live. Allow me to choose my own What the hell? I might make mistakes. Failure is part of life. We all make mistakes. But how are we going to learn from those mistakes? If somebody's got a gun at us saying you can't do that, I mean, do you think the Wright brothers would be allowed to fly?
No,
I
absolutely
mean,
not.
the only reason these billionaires can go to space is why? Because they're billionaires and nobody cares if they die. That's the reality. I'm sure a lot of people are actually rooting for an accident yesterday. Sadly, that is true. Sadly, that is true. It's a bunch of rich guys and nobody else is being really put at risk, but we limit. You know, Thomas Edison, I am convinced he's not wearing goggles when he experimented on the filament for the useful lights. He violated a bunch of work safety regulations. He couldn't have done what he did today. He couldn't have failed, what did he say, 1,000 times, you know, to get the one, right? Limits the scope. So the enemy of thinking is the gun. It's coercion. It's force. It's authority. Think Galileo. An authority with force, right? Not just an authority when, you know, the authority on this topic. I'm the authority who is going to force you to abide by what I say, whether it's the Catholic Church, or whether it's the government, or whether it's the tribal leaders, or whether it's anybody. So, the way in which human beings survive by using their minds, and the way in which we thrive is by using our minds. Our minds require freedom. They require lack of coercion. So, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves in defending is, what is it? We'll talk about that. We need to know what it is. Why is it good?
P-Pop says hi.
No, hey. Well, here's the deal. I got to agree with the guy. It's the force of guns that are limiting our freedom. And that's what's happened to me. You know, when they send the officers over, they haul you into jail for having a buried chunk of concrete in your yard. What happens? They're limiting you. They're coercing you, and they're taking your freedom away. So I think we got the gist of what he's talking about, the philosophical part of freedom, and it's that they are trying to stop you. Well, should we go over to the next one, the student debate? Well, and by the way, notice this is one of the student rooms. These are the supposed student rooms. There weren't very many young people, students in there. Bunch of old guys like me.
Oh, that's what happened. Okay, thank you very much.
Why? Because where does the government get its power to govern if it's not a dictatorship that rules by coercion? Well, if you ask our founders, you'll find that they get their power from the consent of the government. Therefore, and this is what our founders argued when they overthrew English rule in the colonies, that they have a moral obligation and a duty to overthrow tyrannical governments. So who is qualified? Those who are being ruled and gave that power willingly over to the government, they have the right to take some of that back when they break the rules, when they break the social contract. I'd like to respond to their substantive one of undermines political systems. Not at this time. You can type my first response of, I agree. I agree. The second distinction here is undermining political systems is not always bad. In fact, many political systems are wrong and bad, and that's the entire point of why we're trying to disobey them. For example, poll taxes in the South during before the Civil War and even after the Emancipation Proclamation. They would use things like literacy tests. They would use things like poll taxes in order to keep African Americans from voting. Yes, you would undermine the system if you disobeyed that and didn't pay the tax. However, that would still be a morally good thing. My second response is willing to accept the consequences. You're willing to accept the consequences. It is okay if an individual or even a collective of people takes the action that undermines the social system, like voting, if they're willing to accept the consequences. That's what my partner outlined in her first speech. My final response is not revolution. Again, not revolution. My partner specifically limited civil disobedience
to reforming the system, not toppling the system and setting up your own paper tin-pot dictatorship. Sure.
So civil disobedience then is only those times when it ends in a good consequence?
We can't know what's going to happen, but we can know why we're doing what we're doing. In response to the substantive 2, my first response is rights outweigh damage. Rights outweigh damage. First, they didn't address the idea that civil disobedience actually tends to be nonviolent and peaceful. For example, Mahatma Gandhi led millions of people against tyrannical rule who were literally beaten with clubs by British security officers and just took it because they were trying to make a statement and get the government of England's attention. People are willing to take the fight, they're willing to take the consequences, and the rights that are being infringed upon by the government, actually protecting those outweighs some property damage, for example. So this actually does not apply. In response to their specific example of social media, my response is situational ethics. Again, situational ethics. There's a moral principle behind civil disobedience, that people have a duty to break unjust laws and try to reform that stands in this debate round. However, they argue that social media somehow changes a timeless moral principle because of implementation. That should not fly. The argument about South America and President Zuma being overthrown, my response is no context given. Again, no context given. Was there an unfair election? Were they barring people from reaching their polling places and voting? We don't know, so we don't know if this example actually was justified or not. I'd like to touch on my own substantive, our substantive 3, and give you some examples of how civil disobedience has brought positive societal change. First, I'd like to point out that civil disobedience, quite literally, is the option of last resort. It's something you do when you've tried all other things. You try to petition to the government, you try to bring your community together, go to your city council, what have you, and it doesn't work. The ideal goal of civil disobedience is to get the society and the government's attention to the point where they're willing to reason with you and make a change. For example, Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa, he disobeyed the government when a law was created that Indians had to register their thumbprints and their names with the police in South Africa. And then he led millions in nonviolent protests in India itself. All of these led to lasting social change, but had to be achieved through civil disobedience. Thank you.
Assuming so, then I will go ahead and get started. In this debate, there is essentially one major question that you as autonomous individuals have to consider. You have to ask yourself if any given society is benefited by civil disobedience on a net scale. I want to clarify that this is not a historical debate. We're not asking what the civil rights movement could. This is also not any individual or anecdotal debate, because we are looking at this at a broad global scale in a number of different situations, not just the best ones given to you by the proposition side. And when you analyze this question, you have to weigh it on a net scale. And what you're going to hear in this speech is essentially just a bunch of responses to what you heard by the last speaker. I'm going to show you that they have not adequately given you reasons as to how the problems of the information problem Madison talks about are solved through civil disobedience. We tell you that they paint you a very idyllic picture of what civil disobedience is, but they haven't given you the general mechanisms or the average logic that proves it is on a net scale beneficial. Let's start off with the first thing that they discuss. They want to clarify that civil disobedience is essentially intentional. They can just quote Martin Luther King Jr. and say that just laws and unjust laws exist, and the way that you determine this is essentially, how it impacts individuals. Great quote, love Martin Luther King Jr. That's not what we're debating, is whether just laws and unjust laws exist. What we want to tell you is, first of all, that individuals can't decide everything in a society function. They tell us that individuals should decide their lives because they are better at it than the government. Great, we generally agree individuals know more about their lives than the government. But what we are wondering here is whether, like, what is the extent that an individual can determine their lives? We have laws. Every single law restricts your decisions as an individual. If I want to wear my seatbelt, but Texas makes me wear my seatbelt, my decision as an individual is restricted. So we are not wondering whether restrictions should exist on things like whether justice is in any given situation or policy. We're wondering what the limits of that are. I'll get you to this point. The second is that there is no universal agreement. They paint again an idyllic picture that, there are certain key issues. Even if we give them these key issues, which I think is simply not true. If you look at whether every person or every society has agreed that things like murder, adultery, all of these are wrong, I would say you need to look more at the global spectrum of ideas when you look towards countries like North Korea, China, Syria, that are constantly committing murder, that are constantly restricting rights, and they don't seem to be stopping, and there isn't anyone who's kind of been able to prevent that from happening. So I think even if you look at these major universal issues, they still don't win this argument. But I would say on the broader scale, we're looking at the net benefit. Most times in any given situation, you are not going to have any universal or even major agreement between people. So here's where we get to the key point. Why does it, we admit civil disobedience is intentional, but there's an information problem they still haven't really addressed. The question that Madison posed here, the statement she made, is essentially, we have to ask why civil disobedience happens, and the fact is that it's not up to them. They can paint this great picture and define civil disobedience great, and we agree with their general theoretical definition, but I think we all know that practice never matches theory exactly. And so the issue with their side is not that they haven't painted a good picture of what civil disobedience should be, but that your definition of civil disobedience is different than mine. Your understanding of what a particular law is just is different from mine and someone else's in the room. And so for them to get up here and just say, we support just laws is great, but that doesn't actually show that civil disobedience is a net good, because no two people have the exact same understanding of justice, and very rarely do most of society agree on any given issue. Okay, before we move on to their response to our issue about undermining political systems generally,
would side opposition say that the source of a human and individual's rights comes from that individual's government or comes from a higher source?
No, absolutely not from the government, a higher source. I mean, personally, I'm a Christian, so I would say that God instituted these sorts of rights and whatnot. Even if you're not a Christian, I would argue the government is not the provider of these rights. They help protect these rights for a better purpose, but they do not give us these inalienable rights. There's some nuance there with civil rights and whatnot, but I don't think that's the heart of this debate. Okay. We give you this point. Madison talked about how they generally undermine political systems and why that is problematic. Now, their response to this was to say that essentially many political systems are wrong, and I don't think I have to spend a lot of time repeating this because the examples they gave you were like poll taxes and literacy tests, which are not systems, those are individual policies. Our point was not to say that every system is good. It was the opposite. We were saying that there are good and bad systems, but no matter which system you undermine, good or bad, you undermine the concept of a political system itself. We were telling you that it is missing the main point, that some system is necessary in society unless you are advocating for total anarchy. There has to be some rules to the game of how communities function, to how people interact. And we are telling you that when you allow for civil disobedience on this broad scale, and that is what you are encouraging, what happens is that you undermine the legitimacy of systems as a whole, which we think systems are the foundation of societies throughout history, whether they are good or bad. Okay, the other thing they tell you is that civil disobedience is intentional, and therefore it's not just undermining political systems willy-nilly. They have good reasons for doing this. First of all, think about the information problem again. They have not explained to you why it is that most cases of civil disobedience, even are intentional, are good. I do a lot of intentional things. A lot of them are not good. I think a lot of us do that, and so they haven't really given you a good argument for this. The other thing we'll tell you is Madison points out examples like Seattle's Chaz traffic changed names a lot, but there's levels of civil disobedience that are not inherently violent at the start, but they often turn into something that is violent. So again, the other big argument they haven't engaged with is this idea that we are not just debating an individual act of civil disobedience. They also have to engage with what leads from an individual act of civil disobedience. We would love for it to start like something like the civil rights movement, but it doesn't always end with the good changes that we saw in a movement like that. It often ends somewhere like Seattle, or it ends with something like South African riots. With mentioning South African riots, let's move on to the next major part of their speech. They talked to you in response to our point that it is essentially prone to unnecessary damage. This is the slippery slope argument I was just talking about. It starts with civil disobedience, it leads to something a lot worse. They argue that rights outweigh damage that could happen. And I think the problem with this argument is it sounds good on paper, it sounds good as a slogan, but it's a very unnuanced view of upholding rights. Government is not the only violator of rights, and they are not the provider of rights, they are the protectors of them. Now, why is this important? It's important because when we look at the broader net benefit, that maybe it works out in some individual scenarios that they have painted, but we would say that broadly speaking, we're not just looking at whether any government and a specific policy is upholding rights. We are wondering whether that political system as a whole is undermined, and what are the catalysts that kind of come from that. And we think they have not painted you a general picture as to that rights on a broad scale are upheld. The other thing they talk about is how civil disobedience is necessary. And this is, I'll just say, I mean, we didn't pick our sides. It's really hard to argue saying that civil disobedience isn't good sometimes. So that's not what I'm going to tell you. But I want to paint a picture of the difference between civil disobedience and civil resistance. There is a key important difference here, which is that of law breaking. They gave you the 3 criteria. The first one was law breaking. If you look at the civil rights movement, a huge portion of what occurred there was civil resistance, where the laws were not broken, but they were creating cultural change, which they hoped would stream up with political change. This is what we think has oftentimes been most effective, even in the kind of examples that they mentioned. So what they have to tell you is why law breaking is vital in order to provide a general benefit, not a specific one, for the natural rights of people around the world.
That's a lot of money.
So what do you think?
Well, my ears are a little tired. I mean, that was a lot of information to take in quick, and if you could hear them both, they were absolutely making good points, and it was kind of fun to watch a debate where they're actually using rules and, kind of Marcus of Queensberry stuff. But it's interesting what he brought up at the end, civil resistance and civil disobedience, because in my instance, when it came to, say, the wind turbine, I was doing both because I was following Minnesota statute from 1995, but I was breaking the law, performing civil disobedience for Orno's illegal ordinance outlawing the wind turbines. So it's awful interesting how you could actually kind of be doing both at the same time, and I'm guilty of that myself. And you know what? I'm still guilty because of the driveway prosecution and other things. Civil resistance, standing up for yourself. And I think that that's what our country needs more. And I think that that's kind of what the more the focus should be, is the more civil disobedience, the more civil resistance our country gets, the better off we're all going to be in the long run. The more rights we're going to keep, the more fair it's going to be for everybody. But last but not least, should we go down and find the God is a mathematician one? I kind of like that one's just kind of ringing in my head. So I figured, you know what, let's go sit in and see what they have to say near the end about God being a mathematician. Then I think I'm going to sneak over and get me a little mac and cheese with some brisket. Freudy. Right here, so we just got to go right there. And I do want to get out before it ends so I can get my food before the rush. Food court. Food court. And we're on the side, so yeah, we gotta go around.
Mine's definitely this one.
idea. The Pythagoreans, of course, had the notion that the universe was governed by numbers. It was, in some sense, really numbers. And so much so that they knew about the ratio of strings of different notes in music. And they saw the same thing, I thought they did, in the ratio of the orbits of the planets and the stars. So there was this notion of the music of the spheres, and I've been up here looking through, found that it's in Shakespeare's play, Merchant of Venice, where Lorenzo is addressing Jessica, and he says this: "How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Here will we sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness of the night become the touches of sweet harmony. Sit, Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest oar which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubim. Such harmony is in immortal souls. For whilst this muddy vesture of decay, our bodies, doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it." But there's the notion that there's this harmony of the spheres that's if we could hear it, it would sing to us. It's been an idea that's run through mathematics and physics for a long time. I guess one of the fundamental issues is the question: do mathematicians, I'd love to hear what you say, do mathematicians invent mathematics or do they discover mathematics?
So, first of all, I think you earned your key. Okay? Yeah, the idea of the music of the sphere is was so ingrained. And one of the things that was surprised me, the first time I actually read Kepler, because we all know what Kepler did, starting school, but we never read it. It's not like you can read it. But at some point, the case of life led me to read Kepler. He actually has the different chapters on the planets with notes described. So now we're talking about one of the greatest geniuses of all time, and still anchored in these old ideas that in fact these planets produce music. It's partly probably because he wanted to, whenever you come up with new ideas, you're trying to connect with stuff that people already agree or comprehend. So it's something very common for scientists, because you're afraid of the complete rejection. But it's very interesting, so I'm glad you brought that. But now, your question is a more complicated question. Is about Platonism or not in mathematics. So, Platonists believe, I think I probably am one of those, believe that mathematical objects exist. So, the number 3 exists, and triangles exist, and whatever you want to think about that exists. The non-Platonists will tell you, no, they don't exist. Humans or other intelligence, maybe they can create those objects, and then they can study them. So we define a triangle as something that's this and that, the portion of a plane that is encompassed by 3 lines that do not intersect at the same point. That's the triangle. One line, another line, third line, the part inside is the triangle. So we have defined what the triangle is. The triangle didn't exist per se. Mathematicians like to argue about this. Usually we argue when we go to conferences, because the conferences usually are really serious topics, so you talk about equations, stuff like that. Then at night you go for dinner, people drink a little bit more than they should have, and so then the topic usually about whether mathematical numbers exist or numbers are created, and people get pretty deep. My view is that, again, I'm a Platonist, so when I get in those situations with my colleagues, I support the idea that, these objects exist and we just recognize them. Ellipses existed before, in my view. Apollonius, before Diamenechmus, realized if you take a cone and you cut it, you get an interesting thing. But the interesting thing in my mind was already there, but it took us time to cut the cone to see it. But in practical terms, this distinction doesn't change the way we do math. So that's why we talk about it over dinner rather than the regular conference. But philosophers, on the other hand, they have conferences on this. And I don't know what they talk about at dinner.
There was a big controversy a number of years ago when Benedict XVI, the Pope, then now Pope Emeritus, made a statement at the University of Breakout in Germany. I think he forgot for a moment that he was Pope, and that anything he said would be controversial. So he went back to being a professor of theology, and he said something about the fundamental principle. One of the fundamental principles of Christianity is that the universe is rational, And he used John 1, in the beginning was the Word, which in Greek is logos, which has to do with logic and rationality and all that sort of thing. He said that's what makes science possible. And he made the mistake, I think, of contrasting that with Islam, where God can do anything he wants. So immediately there was an outcry. Probably several things got blown up, but you know, the usual response. Yeah. Good argument. But he saw that as fundamental to Christianity and fundamental to the rise of science, that you believe in a creator who functions according to rational rules.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know enough about other religions to comment. You know, Ratzinger was a great theologian. But I think yes, it is true that one of the foundations
Well, there we have it. God is a mathematician. With Peterson and Strupa. I think you can kind of get their gist. They were basically talking about that mathematics is everywhere, so God created everything. He's got to be a mathematician too. Well, there's the first hour. I want to run over and get in line for lunch here before everyone else gets, so Turbine Guy, gonna sign off till next time.